Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun scorched the red earth of Amuaku that dry afternoon, casting long shadows across the sleepy community. Along the quiet roadside that led to a barely developed estate area, a frail old woman sat on a dusty concrete block, her silk dress now faded and stained with the grime of wandering. Her eyes darted about, confused, like a trapped bird with no memory of how it flew into the cage. Her gray hair clung to her wrinkled forehead, and her expensive shoes were caked with mud. Occasionally, she muttered under her breath, "The documents tell them I'm still in charge, don't let them," but no one listened. People walked by assuming she was just another mad beggar or lost grandmother. Not one of them guessed that this woman had once sat atop one of Nigeria's most powerful real estate empires. She had no ID, no phone, no clue where she came from, and no memory of how she ended up there. Only fragments of grand staircases, boardroom battles, and betrayal flickered in and out of her mind like a dying light bulb. As the dust from a passing cement truck settled around her, the woman coughed and pulled her arms around her as though she were shielding something precious, though there was nothing in her arms but dust. Amaka's palms were cracked and rough from lifting cement blocks earlier that day, her brown overalls soaked in sweat and dust. She had just been sent by the site supervisor to retrieve the rusty wheelbarrow they had left by the far corner of the lot the day before. As she trudged along the path, her back aching from a morning of mixing concrete and carrying tiles, her sharp eyes caught the sight of the woman at the roadside. At first, she walked past. After all, she was late, and the foreman had a temper. But something about the woman's posture, not quite begging, not quite mad, tugged at her heart. She paused. The woman wasn't holding out her hand like a beggar, nor was she shouting like the mad people who haunted bus stops. She was simply lost. There was fear in her silence. Amaka turned back, slowly walked toward her, and knelt beside her. "Mama, are you okay?" she asked gently. The woman turned to her with wide, startled eyes, as if she had been awakened from a long dream. I don't know. They stole my name," the old woman whispered. Amaka frowned. She glanced at the woman's clothes. They looked like something from an expensive boutique in Lekki, though now dirted and wrinkled. Her shoes alone could probably pay 3 months of rent. Yet here she was, helpless by the road. After a few seconds of hesitation, Amaka made a decision. She wouldn't leave her there. People had mocked her before for being too kind. "Na so dem day use jazz collect people destiny," one woman once warned her after Amaka had fed a street child. But her late mother had always said, even if you're poor, never turn away from someone who looks more lost than you. It was a principle Amaka lived by, even if it cost her. She gently placed the wheelbarrow she had come to retrieve beside the woman. "Mama, can I take you somewhere safe?" "Just for now," she asked, her voice soft. The woman didn't answer, only looked at her with teary confusion. With effort, Amaka helped her into the wheelbarrow, cushioning her with a piece of sackcloth that had once carried cement. The woman didn't resist. She settled into it like a child giving up the fight to stay awake. And so, with aching arms and a determined spirit, Amaka began to push the wheelbarrow back toward the yard, not knowing she had just become the vessel for a forgotten queen. The wheelbarrow groaned under the old woman's weight as Amaka pushed it along the stony path, her fingers gripping the rusted handles with practiced strength. Sweat dripped into her eyes, but she didn't stop. Her fellow laborers, mostly older men who had made it a habit to mock her, whistled and laughed as she passed by. "Amaka the man-woman done turn nurse," one of them shouted. Another sneered. Maybe she'd carry her future like this. The comment stung, but she had long since learned to bury such pain beneath her resilience. The heat was punishing, and the distance was not short. Still, she moved with a purpose. The woman behind her mumbled again. "Board meeting. I told them not to trust Alawu. The signatures. They forged them." Amaka looked back. The words made no sense. What board? What signatures? Who was Alawu? The old woman's eyes were shut tight, as though she were trapped in the middle of a nightmare. When they reached the edge of the site, Amaka directed the wheelbarrow toward a small abandoned shack once used as a temporary storeroom. It had no door, just faded graffiti on cracked concrete walls. The roof leaked in places, but it was the only shelter she could offer. She helped the woman down gently, guided her to a pile of cardboard boxes that served as makeshift seating, and wiped the sweat from her brow with a worn handkerchief. "I'll get you water," Amaka said, and ran to the construction team's water tank. She returned moments later with a plastic cup and some bread she had saved from breakfast. The woman took it gratefully, her hands trembling, her eyes darting around like a bird unsure of its new nest. "Thank you, child," she whispered, though her voice was far away, almost like she was speaking to someone else in her head. Amaka smiled and sat beside her. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt oddly drawn to the woman, not out of pity, but something deeper, like destiny had pushed their paths together. Hours passed. The foreman yelled at her for being late with the wheelbarrow, but she lied and said it had been stolen. Later, when her shift ended, she returned to the shack, expecting to find the woman gone. But there she was, asleep with her head leaning against the wall. As night approached, Amaka wondered what to do. She didn't have much, barely enough to feed herself, let alone someone else. Yet her conscience wouldn't let her abandon the old woman to the streets. She fetched a blanket from the tiny room she rented in a face-me-a-fisu compound and returned to cover the woman. As she tucked it around her, the old woman stirred. "My name is Victoria. Victoria Nwoko," she murmured. Amaka froze. The name sounded familiar, but from where? She stared at the woman's face and whispered, "Who are you really?" The next morning, Amaka woke up earlier than usual, her muscles aching from the previous day's labor. Her mind was still reeling from the old woman's words. Victoria Nwoko. That name echoed in her head like a haunting melody she couldn't place. As she walked toward the abandoned shack, carrying a plate of gari and groundnut, the best she could offer, she prayed the woman hadn't wandered off in the night. But there she was, sitting on the same pile of cardboard, awake now and staring at the walls as though they held answers to invisible questions. "Good morning, Mama," Amaka greeted softly. The woman turned to her and smiled vaguely. "I had a house that had glass stairs," she said. Amaka frowned. "Where was it?" The woman blinked. I don't remember. But I was important. I used to speak, everyone would listen. But now I'm just noise in the wind." Amaka sat beside her and handed over the plate. The old woman accepted it, but barely ate. Instead, she rambled. Names, places, business terms Amaka had never heard. Something about land allocations, investments, lawsuits. Then she mentioned Alawu again. That name surfaced once more, always with a hint of fear. Amaka began to realize this wasn't madness. These were fragments of a shattered life. Something terrible had happened to this woman, something powerful enough to break her mind. But how could a woman who once lived in a glass house end up like this? Amaka pulled out her small Nokia phone and searched Victoria Nwoko. The results were slow to load, but when they did, her heart nearly stopped. Headlines, images, real estate tycoon, billionaire, CEO of Vic Estates. And then, CEO disappears without trace, bored tight-lipped about details. The woman beside her was not just anyone. She was a queen who had been forgotten by her own empire. As Amaka read further, her heart sank. The company had issued a statement months ago that Victoria had traveled overseas for medical care. But from the woman's condition, it was obvious no such trip had taken place. What if they had lied? What if they had abandoned her? And why? Amaka began to feel an unease she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a missing person story. This was deeper. A conspiracy, perhaps, or a betrayal so massive it shattered even the sharpest mind. And somehow, she, a poor girl with calloused hands and cracked heels, had been pulled into the center of it. Looking over at the frail woman next to her, Amaka whispered a quiet vow. "I don't know who hurt you, but I won't leave you like this. Not again." Amaka stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror in her tiny rented room that night. Her skin glistened with sweat from a hard day's labor, her fingernails stained with cement dust, and her hair tucked beneath a cheap scarf. Sometimes, she wondered what life might have been like if her father hadn't died in that road accident, or if her mother hadn't fallen ill from the stress of raising 3 children alone. She was the last born, but also the strongest. Her brothers had taken to the streets and never returned, while Amaka remained in the village, turning down every shortcut life offered her. Despite her beauty, the kind that often drew whistles from men and side eyes from women, she never allowed it to become a weapon or currency. From the age of 16, she worked alongside bricklayers, masons, and welders just to survive. Each time she lifted heavy blocks, men scoffed. "Pretty face like you should be lying on beds, not carrying cement," they'd say. But Amaka would only smile, lift another bag, and press on. Life had taught her that beauty could fade, but dignity had a longer lifespan. She had tried everything to get into school. She sat for jam twice, scoring well enough to gain admission, but each time the acceptance letters came, the money to register or buy books never followed. She once cried to her uncle in the city, hoping he would help her pay the fees. He agreed, but only if she agreed to be sweet to him. Disgusted and heartbroken, she returned home, that dream buried alongside her self-worth. Yet, in all her suffering, Amaka never lost her humanity. She couldn't walk past a child crying from hunger or ignore a woman looking lost on the road. It wasn't that she had much, but what little she did, she shared. She remembered her mother's final words on her deathbed. "Life is not about how much you gather, Amaka, but how much you give even when you have nothing." Those words had become her compass, guiding her through storms most couldn't even see. And now, in this strange situation with the old woman, that same compass pointed her down a path no one would have expected. Back at the construction site the next morning, Amaka worked with less focus than usual. Her hands moved, but her mind was with the woman she had left resting in the shack. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something bigger than her, something divine, even. When she returned during break time, the old woman was still there, murmuring names and numbers. Amaka began writing things down. Alawu, Waziri Court, Eastern Holdings, Meridian Bank, and again they betrayed me. She didn't understand what any of it meant, but she felt a sense of urgency. She needed to protect this woman, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It was no longer about sympathy, it was about justice. If this woman truly was who the articles online claimed, the CEO of Vickland Estates, then someone had lied. Someone had left her to rot. And that someone would soon discover that even a poor girl with a wheelbarrow could be a storm. The next few days blurred into a routine of secrecy and sacrifice. Every morning before her shift, Amaka would check on the old woman, now properly identified in her heart as Victoria, bathe her with lukewarm water in a small plastic bucket, feed her, and leave her with a borrowed Bible or newspaper to keep her mind busy. After work, she'd return to sit with her until the sun vanished. The other workers had started noticing her strange pattern of movement and whispered behind her back. One of the older masons, Baba Chucks, even confronted her. "You day do nurse for who? We go soon report you owe," he warned with an accusing finger. Amaka responded with a fake laugh and quickly walked away. The truth was, she was hiding a billionaire in the most unlikely place, a rotting concrete hut beside the latrine pit. She kept telling herself she just needed a few more days. Maybe Victoria would remember enough to guide her home. But Victoria's flashes of memory were like lightning, sharp but short-lived. One moment she was reciting company policies, and the next she would forget what year it was. By the 5th day, Amaka's money had nearly run out. She had been skipping meals to feed Victoria. The bread and beans routine was beginning to take its toll on both of them. One evening, when she returned with only half a wrap of moi and a bottle of pure water, Victoria looked at her with clear eyes and whispered, "I used to fly to Dubai just to buy perfume." The statement hit Amaka like a slap. The contrast between what the woman once had and what she had now, covered in a torn wrapper and eating scraps, was staggering. That night, as Amaka lay in her bed, hunger gnawing at her belly, she thought about giving up. She thought about walking away and pretending this never happened. But then she remembered the way Victoria clung to her hand when the workers walked past their shack, as if she knew the girl was her only anchor in a world that no longer recognized her. Amaka made a vow. Even if the whole world turned its back, she wouldn't. The very next morning, trouble came knocking. The foreman had followed her the previous evening and saw her entering the shack. He stormed in during lunch break, flanked by 2 junior supervisors. "So not here you day hide your mad mother, and you day turn this place to rehabilitation center," he bellowed, pointing at Victoria, who sat quietly in a corner, trembling. Amaka stood between them and raised her arms in protest. "She's not mad, sir. She's just sick. I'll take her away by weekend. Please." But the foreman was unmoved. "If she's still day here, by tomorrow you're fired. In fact, you fit day go now, SAF." That night, Amaka didn't cry. She simply sat beside Victoria and whispered softly, "You're not a burden. They just don't understand who you are." She had lost her job, but she had found a mission. She was determined to uncover the truth and find anyone who remembered the queen she was hiding. Long before the days of confusion, broken memories, and dusty roadsides, Victoria Nwoko had been a force of nature. Born into a modest family in Enugu, her brilliance shone early. At just 23, she graduated top of her class from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and began working for a mid-tier real estate firm. Within 2 years, she had climbed to project manager and was overseeing luxury estates for high-net-worth clients. But she wanted more. She saved aggressively, lived frugally, and by 28, Victoria launched Vicland Estates, a modest office space with 2 staff members and a wild dream. Everyone laughed. A woman running real estate? In this country. But she pressed on, driven not just by ambition, but by something deeper. The need to prove that a woman's mind could build kingdoms too. Her first estate project failed, almost bankrupting her, but she sold her car and rebuilt. Within 5 years, she became a household name in Lagos, known for her daring but precise investment strategies and her refusal to sell land to politicians with shady funds. By 35, Victoria was a multi-billionaire. She had 5 estates across Nigeria and clients overseas. She was interviewed on TV, featured in magazines, and invited to speak at prestigious events. But despite all her success, there was a loneliness she couldn't fill. Friends were rare, and trust was expensive. Then came Raymond. Charming, tall, persuasive. He swept her off her feet like a scene from a romance film. For the first time, Victoria let her guard down. He was everything she thought she wanted. Understanding, calm, supportive. He told her he didn't care about her money, only her heart. When he proposed, she said yes, ignoring the warnings of her close aides. "You're moving too fast," they said. "This doesn't feel right." But she had waited so long for companionship, for love. The wedding was private but extravagant. For the first year, she was the happiest woman alive. Then came the papers. Raymond convinced her to merge their accounts. "We're one now, aren't we?" he said. He slowly infiltrated the board. One by one, he pushed out her most loyal managers and replaced them with his own allies. She didn't notice until it was too late. One day, her lawyer showed her a document she had signed, thinking it was for tax purposes, but it was a transfer of major shares to Raymond. The betrayal crushed her. She tried to fight, but the legal documents were airtight. She had unknowingly handed over her empire. Then came the ultimate wound. She returned home one night to find another woman, younger, louder, in her living room. "This is Raymond's house now," the woman said with a smirk. Victoria left with only her handbag and dignity, never to return. From that day forward, she swore off love, family, and everything that required emotional investment. She would rebuild, yes, but never again would she love. Never again would she trust. Victoria's life after marriage was, at first, a dream she had long buried beneath business meetings and acquisition plans. Raymond was perfect, too perfect. He brought her breakfast in bed, kissed her forehead before board meetings, and called her Queen V, with so much charm that her staff began doing the same. He attended meetings with her, often asking the right questions and offering suggestions that earned the board's respect. When he proposed forming a holding company for their assets, she agreed without hesitation. After all, they were now husband and wife, bound not just by love, but by vision. What Victoria didn't know was that behind the curtain of his smile was a man who had studied her every move, every weakness, every emotional need. Raymond had no background in real estate, but he had perfected the art of emotional manipulation. He didn't attack Victoria with force. He used affection, made her laugh, and presented betrayal as partnership. The day she signed the merger documents, he took her out to dinner. There were roses on the table and a violinist playing her favorite jazz tune. She never questioned the papers. As the months passed, she began to notice small changes. Her former legal advisor, whom she trusted deeply, was replaced by Raymond's cousin. Her financial reports were no longer sent to her directly, but filtered through Raymond's newly structured executive team. She chalked it up to restructuring and continued working, convincing herself that this was what love looked like: compromise, sacrifice, building together. But things began to unravel when she tried to push through a land deal and was told she no longer had the power to authorize major decisions. Stunned, she called a meeting with her legal team, only to find unfamiliar faces in the boardroom. When she asked to see the documents she had signed, her blood turned to ice. The signature was hers, but the contents were poison. Raymond had set up a series of documents transferring her shares, voting rights, and even personal assets into joint holdings, all managed by him. In her desperation to be loved, she had signed away the kingdom she built. The confrontation was quiet. Victoria didn't scream or throw things. She simply packed her bag, walked into the living room where Raymond was sipping a glass of wine beside a smirking, heavily made-up woman, and said, "You won't get away with this." Raymond didn't flinch. "You made it easy," he replied. "You wanted love. I wanted power." That night, Victoria disappeared from the world. She left behind her mansion, her board seat, and the entire legacy she had built. Her face vanished from newspapers. Rumors swirled, but no one knew the truth. In a hotel room with peeling walls and a broken lamp, Victoria stared at her own reflection and whispered, "Never again." Her heart hardened. She would rebuild, but not for love, not for companionship. She had been used, dismantled, and discarded. But she was not broken, just bruised. And bruises heal. Years after Victoria vanished from the public eye, Raymond and his mistress, Anita, took over the mansion Victoria once called home. They lived extravagantly, throwing wild parties, entertaining corrupt politicians, and building their own image as Nigeria's new power couple. But what they didn't know was that while they basked in the glow of stolen wealth, Victoria was clawing her way back to relevance. With what little she had left, some foreign stocks, a secret offshore account, and 2 loyal former assistants, she began piecing together a new company, far away from the prying eyes of a Lagos elite. It was slow and painful. She was denied loans. Investors turned her away, unable to believe that the once mighty Victorian Woko had been reduced to renting a one-room office in Yaba. But she persisted. She sold everything she owned, lived like a pauper, and poured every naira into her dream. She worked during the day and strategized at night, surviving on noodles and resilience. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reclaiming her soul. Meanwhile, Raymond's greed began to poison everything he touched. With no real business acumen, he mismanaged Vic Land Estates. Deals fell through. Projects stalled. The board grew restless. Investors began to panic. Rumors of internal power struggles filled business tabloids. And for the first time in years, Raymond began to fear that his empire, the one he stole, might crumble. He tried to bring in consultants, but the damage was done. Unpaid contractors began dragging the company's name through the mud. In private, Anita grew cold and bored. She had never loved him, just the lifestyle he offered. And now that the money was drying up, her patience began to wither. One night, in a fit of rage, she screamed, "You're nothing without her. You can't even run a kiosk without that woman." Raymond slapped her. The next morning, she left. By the time Raymond realized how deeply he had fallen, it was too late. His own allies on the board were already plotting his exit. Victoria watched from a distance. She had no interest in revenge, not yet. Her focus was singular, rebuild. And that she did. She formed Vinovo Properties, a new firm cloaked under a shell company to avoid media attention. With her signature strategy of affordable luxury, she quickly acquired a loyal customer base. Within 6 years, she had outgrown her previous success. Investors begged to buy shares. She refused. She appointed herself CEO again and kept her circle tight. Men came knocking, wealthy suitors, old flames, even foreign investors who flirted under the guise of business. She dismissed them all. "I married once," she'd say. "That was one mistake too many." Alone, but not broken, Victoria rebuilt her empire brick by brick, each stone laid with the lessons of betrayal. She never remarried, never loved. Her boardroom became her sanctuary. Her documents became her children. She was no longer just Victoria Nwoko. She was a fortress. But even fortresses have cracks. And no one knew that behind her fierce eyes was a woman who had never truly healed, just buried the wound deep enough to forget it. Victoria's second empire was quieter, more calculated, and less glamorous. Gone were the lavish office buildings with golden chandeliers and fancy espresso machines. Her new headquarters in Surulere was modest, a 3-story building painted white and blue, with a no-nonsense reception desk and 2 security guards who knew her rules by heart. No walk-ins. No media. No distractions. She had changed. Her smile was rarer, her voice colder, and her once famous charity arm had been dissolved entirely. "Let others play Mother Teresa," she told one staff member. "I'm done feeding snakes." But what hadn't changed was her brilliance. She made strategic acquisitions, buying distressed properties at half their value and turning them into income-generating estates. She remained a ghost to the press. No interviews, no public photos, no events. Most people believed she had moved abroad. Only a few in her inner circle knew she was still in Nigeria, still building, still fighting, but this time for herself alone. Behind her tough exterior, however, Victoria carried deep emotional scars. She didn't trust her board fully, despite personally hand-picking each member. Every contract was double-checked, every decision documented. She had grown paranoid, but in her world, paranoia was survival. She kept a private psychologist on retainer, though she rarely showed up for appointments. The fear of betrayal hung over her like a dark cloud. She never wrote a will, never named a successor. "Let the vultures fight when I'm gone," she'd mutter. She developed insomnia, surviving on black coffee and 3 hours of sleep per night. But she didn't care. Her success was her shield, and every new project completed was another arrow against the ghosts of her past. What she didn't realize, however, was that she was burning out. Her staff began to notice her forgetfulness, missed names, wrong figures, documents left unsigned. They dismissed it at first as fatigue, but over time it grew worse. Then, one day, she disappeared. She had gone for a weekend drive to clear her head, something she hadn't done in years, and never returned. Her driver claimed she asked him to stop near a remote village in Ogun State, said she wanted to take a walk alone, and vanished into thin air. The company went into quiet panic. A few trusted board members launched a private search, using hush money to keep the story out of the press. After all, how could they admit that the CEO of a multi-billion naira empire was possibly losing her mind? They told staff she was overseas on extended medical leave. But the truth was, Victoria Nwoko, the queen who had rebuilt her throne from ashes, was now wandering the streets, robbed not of her wealth this time, but of her memory. And no one knew that the only person who could bring her back wasn't a doctor, lawyer, or board member, but a wheelbarrow girl from a forgotten construction site. At the heart of Lagos Island stood the imposing glass towers of Vickland Estates, a symbol of power, wealth, and corporate dominance. The staff still filed in every morning with polished shoes and clipboards in hand, but there was an invisible weight in the air since the CEO's disappearance. The receptionist's smile had dulled. The personal assistant to Madame Victoria now sat quietly, her red lipstick a shade dimmer than usual. Inside the executive boardroom, whispers flew like daggers, though no one dared to say anything out loud. The truth was terrifying. The CEO of one of Nigeria's most valuable real estate empires had vanished without warning, and only a few people knew the true reason: dementia. Victoria Nwoko had been slowly losing her memory, and her final episode had seen her walking out of her residence and never returning. Her personal driver, paid off handsomely, claimed she insisted on a solo stroll. He was immediately relocated out of the country to keep the scandal buried. Vicland couldn't afford the world knowing that its iron-fisted leader, who held billions in assets under her signature, was no longer mentally stable. Inside the boardroom, tension sat between them like a ticking bomb. Chief Alawu, one of the oldest board members and the head of internal strategy, stood at the window staring out at the city below. He wasn't sad, he was calculating. For years, he had played second fiddle to Victoria, carefully watching her climb back from betrayal and rebuild her empire. While others admired her, he resented her. She had refused his subtle advances when he was younger. She had called out his proposals as shallow and power-hungry during meetings. Now, with her gone, he saw opportunity. The company cannot afford instability, he finally said. We need to appoint a temporary acting CEO. Others hesitated. But she could come back, one young board member whispered. Then let her come back and take over, Alawu snapped. But until then, we move forward. Unknown to most in the room, Alawu had already been in secret talks with the company's legal advisor, Bar Igioma, preparing documents that would make it almost impossible for Victoria to return to power, dementia or not. The search for Victoria was kept internal and discreet. Private investigators were paid in cash. CCTV footage from her last sighting was scrubbed clean. Staff members were told she had traveled for a special health treatment and would return when stable. But the truth grew harder to bury as days turned to weeks and then months. Project approvals slowed down. Investors began to call more frequently, demanding updates. The public was curious but confused, not yet alarmed. Vicland's PR team had been trained by the best. Still, cracks were forming. Documents that required her signature were delayed. Big clients asked to meet her personally before closing deals. And amidst all the facades, Chief Alawu sat in his office late into the night, sipping whiskey, already imagining his name etched on the glass door. Acting CEO, Chief Alawu Adebayo. What none of them knew, however, was that just a few miles away, the real queen of the empire lay sleeping in a concrete shack, her mind flickering in and out like a candle struggling to stay lit. On a cloudy Tuesday afternoon, a man named Pa Okachukwu, former regional manager of Vicland Estates, sat on a broken bench outside a betting shop in Mushin, fanning himself with a church pamphlet. Now retired and half forgotten, Pa Okachukwu still kept tabs on the industry he once helped shape. While heading home with a loaf of bread tucked under his arm, he took a shortcut through the nearby construction site, as he often did. As he passed the half-abandoned structure near the toilets, he heard a soft humming, a woman's voice, rich and broken. Curious, he peered inside. What he saw froze him to the ground. There, sitting on a torn mat with hair loosely tied and a wrapper around her legs, was none other than Victoria Nwoko. Her features were aged and tired, but unmistakable. He stepped closer, unsure if his mind was playing tricks. "Madam V," he said, trembling. She looked up, blinking at him. "I know you. You used to bring me the Ibadan reports," she whispered. Pa Okachukwu nearly dropped his bread. He rushed in, kneeling beside her. "Jesus, it's you. What happened? Where have you been? The company is falling apart. We thought you died." But she could barely respond. Her hands trembled. "They took everything again," she mumbled, before sinking into silence. Pa Okachukwu stood up and ran toward the site workers, yelling for help. That was when Amaka came running, eyes wide with panic. "Leave her alone," she screamed, standing protectively in front of Victoria. "She doesn't like too many people." The older man blinked at her in confusion. "You've been the one taking care of her?" Amaka nodded. "Since the day I found her by the roadside." He pulled out his old phone and shakily dialed a number he hadn't called in years. the private line of Vickland's executive secretary. "I found her," he said. "Don't ask questions. Send someone you trust. Come quietly." Within an hour, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled into the site. Men in black suits stepped out, accompanied by a female nurse in a crisp white uniform. They took Victoria gently, speaking to her like she was a wounded bird. Amaka watched in shock as they placed her in the back seat of the SUV and drove off. One of the men handed her an envelope with some cash. "Thank you for your help," he said briskly, avoiding eye contact. "We'll take it from here." Then they were gone, leaving behind dust, silence, and a girl with more questions than answers. Amaka stood there, clutching the envelope as her heart raced. Who were those people? Why didn't they ask for her name or offer a way to follow up? Something didn't sit right. The woman she had cared for, cried with, and fed from her own savings, was now in the hands of people who looked more interested in control than care. And in that moment, Amaka made herself a promise. She wouldn't walk away. Not yet. The office of Vickland Estates was quiet when the convoy returned with Victoria. The senior board members were waiting in the underground garage, away from prying eyes. Her arrival was not celebrated. There was no media announcement, no banners, and no corporate welcome. Instead, she was ushered through the back entrance of the East Wing, a private section of the building with a luxury suite and medical equipment. Dr. Isake, the company's private physician, was already waiting, and the nurse who accompanied Victoria from the shack took instructions in hushed tones. Bar, Igioma, and Chief Alawu stood in the corner, watching silently. "She remembers fragments," the nurse explained. "But most of her memories fade quickly." The doctor nodded. "Then let's keep her away from stress. No board meetings. No calls. No visitors." They all agreed. Victoria was too dangerous in her current state, not because she was violent, but because she was unpredictable. If the investors learned that the Queen of Vickland was slowly losing her mind, the stock value would plummet. In a closed-door emergency meeting that evening, the board decided to bury the story. "She is safe," Alawu announced. "That is what matters. But we must protect the company's future." A younger board member raised a hand. "Shouldn't we inform the shareholders?" Alawu's eyes narrowed. "And tell them what? That our founder is now a mumbling shadow? That's financial suicide." The silence was heavy. No one argued. On paper, Victoria was marked as on extended convalescence due to exhaustion. All her powers were temporarily transferred to a 3-man committee: Alawu, Igioma, and Dr. Isake. Their reason? To protect company continuity. But beneath the surface, a darker truth brewed. These 3 had no intention of letting her return. In fact, if her condition worsened, they would petition for a permanent transfer of power. And if anyone, especially that strange girl from the construction site, began asking questions, they'd make sure those questions were never answered. Amaka returned to the construction site the next day, expecting to feel relief, but instead, an unfamiliar emptiness greeted her. The shack was abandoned. The mat folded. The cup and tin plate she had left behind were gone. It was as if Victoria had never existed. Her co-workers said nothing, though some stared at her longer than usual. She asked around. No one knew who the men in suits were, or where they had taken the woman. That evening, she opened the envelope they had given her. It contained 50,000 Nigerian nairas in crisp notes, and a short note that read, "Thank you. Do not follow up." Something in her snapped. This was no rescue. This was a cover-up. She didn't have wealth or connections, but she had her instincts. And her instincts told her something terrible was happening behind those glass walls. And if no one else would speak, she would. Amaka returned to the Vickland Estates premises 3 days after Victoria was taken, dressed in her only decent outfit, a faded but neatly pressed blouse and skirt. She approached the sleek security gate, clutching the envelope they had given her. She hoped it would serve as proof of her connection to the old woman, or at least earn her an audience with someone inside. But the moment the security man at the gate saw the envelope and heard her mention Madame Victoria, his demeanor shifted. "Madame is not available," he said sharply, as though rehearsed. You can't see anyone. Leave now, or I'll call the police. Amaka stood there, stunned, her mouth slightly open. But I helped her. She was lost. I Ogunode. Go back, the man snapped, slamming the small gate shut. The loud metallic clang echoed in her ears like a verdict. She stood there a few moments longer, processing what had just happened. Something wasn't right. She had saved this woman, cared for her, and now they were pretending she never existed. As she turned to leave, she noticed a man in a dark suit observing her from the second floor of the building across the road. His eyes followed her every movement, and as she walked farther down the street, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She picked up her pace. Just as she was about to cross the road, someone grabbed her arm. It was another security officer, not from the gate, but clearly connected. Don't come back here, he whispered gruffly. It's not safe. Not for you. Stay in your lane, girl. You've done your part. Then he released her and walked away like nothing happened. Amaka's heart pounded. Fear and fury danced in her chest. She had been warned, not politely, but with quiet menace. That night she didn't sleep. She lay in her bed, replaying every detail of the last few days. Why had they been so eager to whisk Victoria away in silence? Why wasn't there a public announcement? Why was the company acting like she was a threat instead of a savior? By morning, Amaka had made up her mind. She returned to the cybercafe she sometimes used to look up jobs and began researching everything she could about Vic Land Estates, Victoria Nwoko, and the current board members. She found news reports, all of them vague, about Victoria's medical trip abroad. But what stood out were the recent changes in the company's leadership. Within just days of Victoria's disappearance, a transitional leadership council had been formed, placing Chief Alawu in de facto control. No press conference. No investor communication. Just a quiet shuffling of power. Amaka sat back in the rickety plastic chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a sick woman anymore. It was about power, greed, and erasure. They wanted Victoria forgotten, hidden. Why? She didn't have the answers yet, but she felt the sting of injustice burning in her chest. She hadn't come this far just to be silenced. If they wouldn't tell the truth, she'd find someone who would listen. Chief Alawu leaned back in the CEO's chair in the executive conference room, a sly smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It had taken years, but he was finally seated at the helm of the empire he had always believed he deserved. Victoria had built it, yes, but he had always felt she ruled with too much sentiment and not enough cunning. Women were too emotional, he often muttered behind closed doors. Now, with her mind deteriorating and her presence locked away in the East Wing, he was in control, technically temporary, but in practice, absolute. Beside him sat Barrister Igioma, her face calm, but eyes razor-sharp. We must act quickly, she said. The girl, the construction worker, she's already asking questions. If she connects the dots or reaches the media, things could spiral. Alawu nodded. We must find a way to control the narrative, bury the girl's involvement, and solidify Victoria's medical incapacitation legally. Their plan was simple but diabolical. The company would quietly file for full guardianship of Victoria through a private medical review board, with Dr. Isake's cooperation. A report would be submitted stating that Victoria was unfit to run any business and should be placed under institutional care. That would allow them to move her permanently to a private health facility of their choosing, far from any curious eyes. Meanwhile, Alawu would tighten his grip on operations, gradually introducing reforms that would benefit him and a few loyalists. Any board member who questioned him would be sidelined or forced out with subtle threats and bribery. And if the girl, what was her name again? Amaka, refused to stay quiet, they'd paint her as a gold digger trying to blackmail the company. We're too close to let a street girl ruin this, Alawu said coldly. Let's deal with her before she becomes a problem. But not everyone on the board was blind or complicit. One of the junior board members, Tokunbo Bamadil, a sharp-minded but cautious young man, had been watching Alawu closely. Something didn't sit right with him about Victoria's return. He had once sat in meetings where Victoria's mind was razor-sharp, her memory impeccable. How did that woman suddenly become a ghost? And why was her savior being dismissed like a common nuisance? When he overheard Igioma whispering about forging documents for medical incapacitation, he realized he had to act. But act how? And at what risk? Meanwhile, Amaka had begun digging deeper. Her instincts were now matched by determination. She started jotting down every strange thing that had happened, names, times, events, and slowly, unknowingly, build a case. She didn't have power, but she had something more dangerous, the truth. And the truth, no matter how buried, always finds its way to the surface. Amaka's unease turned to obsession. She spent the next week quietly gathering every piece of information she could find. She tracked down the retired manager, Pa Okachukwu, and pleaded for a meeting. At first, he was reluctant. "My child, this is not your fight," he warned. But when she shared what she had seen, the threats she had received, and the silence surrounding Victoria's condition, he sighed deeply. "You remind me of her, he said. Fierce, unyielding. Victoria never backed down from a fight." He told Amaka about the Victoria of old, the battles she fought in boardrooms, the deals she sealed with brilliance, and the way she clawed her way back after betrayal. If she truly is in danger, then she needs someone to be her voice. That was all the encouragement Amaka needed. She crafted an anonymous email account and began writing everything she knew, the wheelbarrow, the secrecy, the threats, the hidden East Wing. But no one responded. So she took a bolder step. She created a Twitter account using a false name and made a thread. "What if I told you the missing CEO of Vic Land Estates was found weeks ago, and they're hiding her?" She attached a blurry photo she had taken of Victoria in the shack and added, "They don't want you to know the truth." At first, it was ignored. But within hours, it began to spread. A few retweets turned to dozens, then hundreds. People asked for proof, for more. Amaka stayed anonymous, but hinted at her role. She shared a screenshot of the envelope they had given her, with the company's logo. Then came the hashtags, hashtag where is Victoria and hashtag free the CEO. Bloggers picked up the story. Online forums began speculating. Was the Queen of Vicland being held hostage? Was the company covering up something bigger? Amaka had lit the first match, and the fire was catching. The response from the company was swift and brutal. A counter-thread appeared hours later, posted by a fake account claiming to be a former colleague of Amaka. It accused her of lying, of being mentally unstable, and of trying to extort money from Vicland. But it backfired. More people began asking questions. Who was this Amaka? Why was a young girl even connected to the CEO? Why hadn't there been a public update about Victoria's health? Suddenly, journalists began digging into old reports. Some recalled Victoria's absence months ago and noted the lack of transparency. A few dared to email the company directly and received no response. The pressure was mounting. Inside the East Wing, Victoria, still fragile but slowly regaining bits of memory, sat by the window and murmured one name, the girl with the wheelbarrow finder. The storm had begun. The backlash from social media came like a thunderstorm. Vicland's public relations department tried to contain the damage, issuing a vague statement that Victoria Nwoko was resting privately, and that false rumors were being investigated. But the internet wasn't satisfied. The hashtags only grew louder. Influencers picked up the story, some seeing it as a human interest piece, others digging deeper to expose a systemic cover-up. Amaka, though still hiding behind an alias, could feel the ground shifting. She started receiving strange messages, anonymous DMs telling her to stop while she could, some pleading with her to delete her posts before they came for her. The fear began to creep in, and for a moment, she considered vanishing. But every time she remembered Victoria's trembling voice, her confused eyes, and the way the board had treated her like a liability instead of a human being, her resolve hardened. She hadn't come this far just to run now. She had no fancy office, no money, no bodyguards, just her phone, a cheap laptop she borrowed from a friend, and the truth. One evening, as she walked home from the cyber cafe, she noticed a black car trailing her slowly. She quickened her pace, ducking into a side street near a closed mechanic workshop. The car idled at the junction for a few seconds, then drove off. Her chest pounded like a war drum. By the time she got home, she knew she couldn't stay there anymore. That night, she packed her few belongings into a small bag and went to stay with Ada, a friend she had known since childhood. Ada didn't ask too many questions. She simply opened the door and listened. Amaka told her everything. At the end, Ada sat in stunned silence before saying, "Then we fight. Because if it were me, I'd want someone like you in my corner." The next day, Ada helped her connect with a popular content creator known for exposing injustice. He had a large following and a reputation for not backing down. Meanwhile, Chief Olawu was in panic mode. The situation had spiraled far beyond what he had planned. Investors had begun demanding updates, and his own lawyers were beginning to worry about the optics. "This girl must be silenced permanently," he hissed during a late-night meeting with Bar. Ijeoma. "We underestimated her." Ijeoma, usually composed, looked tense. "If we touch her now, it'll confirm everything. But if we wait, this could bring the entire company down." They considered discrediting her further, planting fake criminal charges, or even staging a scandal. But the problem was, Amaka had already ignited something in the public: sympathy for the forgotten, rage against the powerful, and a thirst for truth. The game had changed, and the girl with the wheelbarrow, once seen as nothing more than a lowly laborer, was now the symbol of a resistance they never saw coming. The internet can be many things: brutal, chaotic, fast-moving, but above all, it is relentless. Once a story catches fire, it's nearly impossible to contain. Within 48 hours of Amaka's thread gaining momentum, major bloggers and online platforms across Nigeria and beyond had picked it up. Headlines flooded timelines. Is Victoria Nwoko being held against her will? CEO found in shack by Wheelbarrow Girl. Vicland in crisis. Cover-up or misunderstanding? Even international outlets began to show interest. Amaka's alias trended on Twitter. People created artwork depicting her as a heroine pushing an old woman up a hill, with vultures lurking in the shadows. While the media sensationalized it at the heart of a storm, Victoria's name refused to be buried. Thousands demanded answers, and soon they weren't just asking where she was, they were asking why her voice had been silenced. Amaka, though overwhelmed, began working closely with the influencer Ada had introduced her to. His name was Stanley, and he had over 400,000 followers. After verifying her identity and confirming her story with old photos and voice notes, Stanley went public. He did a live video recounting Amaka's story, showing screenshots of her chats, the envelope she was given, and documents Pa Okachukwu provided, including his own testimony. His voice thundered as he said, "This girl saved the queen, and the palace is trying to erase them both." The video went viral, racking up over 3 million views in 2 days. People began organizing online protests, tagging government officials, business watchdogs, and even celebrities. Some sent gifts and donations to Amaka through Stanley, and for the first time in her life, she had more than 10,000 Nigerian nairas in her account. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was that people were finally listening. Inside Vicland, the boardroom felt like a sinking ship. Every call was a complaint. Every email was a demand. Their attempts to discredit Amaka had failed, and worse, some of their own internal communications had been leaked by a whistleblower, likely Tokunbo, who had grown more defiant. Dr. Isake, now under immense pressure, hesitated to proceed with the forged medical guardianship documents. "If this explodes, I'll lose my license," he warned. Chief Olawu slammed his fist on the table. "Then make it disappear." But nothing was disappearing. In fact, everything was becoming clearer. Investors began pulling out of pending deals, and several high-ranking staff submitted their resignations quietly, not wanting to be tied to the scandal. The company's stock dipped for the first time in months. Vicland's iron facade was cracking, and Amaka, armed with nothing but courage and conscience, was the wedge driving the crack wider every day. On the first Monday of the month, Vicland's usually bustling reception was unusually quiet. Staff whispered in corners. Phones rang constantly, but few were answered. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety as journalists camped outside, cameras ready, microphones raised. Though security had orders not to let anyone in, photos of the East Wing had leaked, blurry, dim images of a fragile old woman sitting beside a hospital bed, a woman who looked like Victoria Nwoko. The board could no longer pretend the issue didn't exist. The chairman, an older, politically connected man who had always supported Victoria, called an emergency meeting. He stared each board member down, then asked one question: "Is it true?" Alawo fumbled. Ijeoma looked away. Tokumbo, the youngest, stood and said, "Yes, sir. And worse, they've been hiding it from us all." The room fell silent. Within hours, the chairman released a statement to the press, acknowledging Victoria's fragile health and confirming her recent recovery. He did not admit to a cover-up, but his carefully worded message offered a sharp turn from previous denials. "We are working to ensure our CEO receives the care she needs while honoring her legacy," the statement read. But that wasn't enough. Civil society organizations demanded an independent investigation. Online commentators called for Alawo and Ijeoma's suspension. Shareholders convened an emergency forum. Questions flew like arrows. How long had she been missing? Who knew? Who authorized the secrecy? And most importantly, why had no one informed the public? The answers were messy and damning. Leaked emails revealed discussions about transferring Victoria's shares. Legal analysts confirmed that such actions bordered on fraud. The board was cornered. Back at the hospital where Victoria was now properly admitted under round-the-clock care, something remarkable happened. For the first time in weeks, she recognized her own name without prompting. "I'm Victoria Nwoko," she said to the nurse, then paused. "And I want to see the girl with the wheelbarrow." The staff scrambled to contact the chairman. "She's requesting someone named Amaka," they reported. And that single sentence, relayed over a quiet phone line, changed everything. The chairman ordered his personal assistant, "Find the girl, bring her here, and tell the press, the Queen has remembered." As the world waited with bated breath, and the empire she built began to reawaken, it was clear: Victoria was not done yet. And neither was Amaka. The hospital was quiet when Amaka arrived, though her heart wasn't. It pounded with so much force she could hear it in her ears as she was led down the pristine hallway toward a private suite. Everything around her was white: the walls, the curtains, even the shoes of the nurse walking ahead. Amaka felt strangely out of place in her borrowed gown and slightly worn slippers, but no one judged her. Since the online campaign broke wide open, the narrative had shifted. She was no longer just the wheelbarrow girl. She was the symbol of hope, integrity, and an unbending conscience. And now, the very woman whose voice had been muffled was requesting her by name. The room smelled of antiseptic and flowers. There, lying propped up against fluffy pillows, was Victoria, not the lost old woman in a dusty wrapper, but a reawakening queen with weary eyes and a faint smile that warmed the soul. "Amaka," she whispered, "my girl with the wheelbarrow." Tears burned Amaka's eyes as she rushed forward and gently took Victoria's hand. The old woman's fingers were thin, her skin soft but warm with life. "You remember me?" Amaka asked shakily. Victoria nodded, her eyes watery. "Not everything, but enough. I remember your kindness, the way you looked at me like I mattered, even when I was nothing." Amaka swallowed hard. "You were never nothing, Ma. They just didn't want you to know who you were." Victoria's grip tightened slightly. She glanced at the door and whispered, "They tried to lock me away, to steal it all again. But I won't let them." The nurse stepped forward to adjust her pillows, but Victoria raised a hand. "Please leave us for a moment." When they were alone, she looked back at Amaka and said, "I know now what I must do, but I need you with me. I can't trust anyone else." And in that quiet, sacred moment, the bond between the billionaire and the bricklayer's daughter became unbreakable, forged not by money or power, but by loyalty in a time of darkness. By the time the hospital staff returned, Victoria was sitting upright, requesting a phone and a notebook. Her voice was still weak, but her clarity was unmistakable. She asked for a list of board members. She asked if Alawo was still active. When the nurse confirmed, Victoria said simply, That ends soon. A doctor came in, visibly shocked to see the change in her demeanor. Madam, we were told your memory would never return in full, he said. Victoria smiled faintly. They told me a lot of things. Outside the room, reporters lined the hospital entrance, trying to confirm rumors that she had spoken. The chairman arrived an hour later, stunned by her transformation. Victoria, he breathed. You're back. She nodded. Not fully, but enough to know who I am, and enough to finish what I started. Her next request was simple. Bring Amaka to Vicland. I want her beside me. And alert legal. I have some accounts to settle. The ride to Vicland's headquarters was surreal. Amaka sat beside Victoria in the back seat of a luxury black SUV, the same kind she used to admire from afar while pushing carts through dust. Victoria wore dark sunglasses and a scarf around her head, more to shield herself from the cameras than the sun. The streets were flooded with press vans and onlookers holding phones. As they pulled through the front gate, the very one where Amaka had once been chased away, security stood at full attention. Inside the lobby, the entire staff had gathered, stunned into silence. For the first time in months, Victoria Nwoko walked through the front doors of her company. Not as a rumor, not as a memory, but as a living storm of reckoning. With Amaka by her side, she entered the elevator. They won't know what hit them, she said quietly. Amaka, still overwhelmed, simply nodded. She was standing beside the very woman she once carried in a wheelbarrow. The world had changed. Upstairs, the boardroom was in chaos. Chief Alawu had been trying to contain the fallout from the hospital photo leaks when the intercom buzzed. She's here. His heart sank. Who? He asked. Madam Victoria. And the girl. Before he could respond, the doors burst open. Victoria stepped in, calm but commanding, followed by Amaka and the chairman. Everyone stood instinctively. Alawu tried to speak. Victoria, we didn't expect. Be quiet, she said, her voice no longer frail but filled with ice. This isn't your company. She placed her palm on the table. I want an emergency vote. Effective immediately, Alawu and Ijeoma are to be suspended pending investigation for attempted seizure of company control. Gasps filled the room. Ijeoma stood up to object, but the chairman raised a hand. Seconded. The vote passed swiftly. Alawu stared at Amaka with disbelief and venom. This is your doing. Amaka met his gaze without flinching. I just told the truth. As security escorted the disgraced board members out, Victoria took a seat at the head of the table, her rightful place. She turned to Amaka. You don't know how rare people like you are. You gave me back my dignity when I had none. Now it's time the world knows who you are. Amaka blushed, overwhelmed. I didn't do it for anything. I just couldn't walk away. Victoria nodded, deeply moved. Which is why you'll never walk alone again. She turned to the board. Effective immediately, Amaka is to be appointed as my special executive assistant, with full clearance. The board clapped, some hesitantly. The doors had opened, not just for Victoria's return, but for a girl who had spent her whole life fighting silently in the shadows. As the meeting ended, Victoria looked out over her company with a faint smile. They tried to bury me, she said softly, but they forgot I'm a seed. And beside her, Amaka smiled too, because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.